about three more, but I think that may be perfect. Okay. Oh, here we go. Somebody's coming. Let's see who we have. I wasn't sure who it is. Okay. Well, let me kick this off, and the meeting is being recorded. Okay. Let me kick it off. And so as you all know that welcome, because it's good to have Cozy here and the team of the College Inside Track. As you probably, if you haven't looked at them, they really help families navigate the college search process. And the goal is really to find the right fit for students and families. And it's not just financially. I know that we said that we were going to talk about the FAFSA tonight, but they really work very hard to find the right fit academically as well. You know, one of the things that I learned in applying for colleges with my four sons is that in New England, we tend to get a little tunnel vision. We look at the same 10 to 20 schools, you know, NESCAC might it be a good example. And we compete against one another. And so one of the advantages that I think in working with a team like Cozy's is if they really kind of expand the number of schools that you might look at. And they really try to properly match not just the financial considerations of the family, but the talents of the kids, the academic backgrounds, and the personal interests. And so they develop kind of a larger funnel of college considerations, and I think help families narrow them down based on what is the right fit for that family's children. And so they know the nuances of many of the schools. They're familiar and communicate pretty frequently with a lot of schools' admissions offices. And so if paying for college is a concern, then they look for ways to reduce those out-of-pocket expenses. But the real focus is to find the right fit for that student, given the total students picture. And you know, like so many financial decisions, this is how I look at it. If we make the right one, we save money. And if we make the wrong one, sometimes it's just because we don't really understand how the game is played. And I think that's where a team like, you know, the Inside Track can be helpful. So again, we're entertaining questions. If you have one, just type it in the chat bar, and we'll take some breaks throughout this, and I'll ask Cozy the questions that come in. And with all that, here's Cozy.
Thanks, Sally. No need to cover this. You did a beautiful job. The one thing I always point out to people is we've been doing this for 20 years, right? So we're not a new company. We've been helping families for a very long time. And just by getting people really good information to make decisions by, it just naturally brings down the stress level that is associated with the college search process itself. So things we'll cover today. We're going to talk about the use of the FAFSA and the CSS profile and how those work. Also fill you in on the updates for this year and the challenges surrounding the FAFSA. We're going to talk about how the grouping of schools that are on the selective list continues to grow and why that is. We're also going to touch on testing and the impact that grade inflation is having on testing. And then lastly, we'll talk about early decision applications and the impact that early decision has on both acceptance and cost. But I always think it's helpful to level set, do a little state of the state. This is what college looks like today. So when we take a peek at tuition pricing over the last 30 years, what we see is that our public institutions have increased their prices by about 213%. Private schools, by comparison, have actually gone up 415% in that same timeline. However, I think it might be helpful before you get out your wet noodles and start lashing private schools for that crazy increase. It's helpful to take a look at our public flagship universities. So the flagship schools are the main university of their state. Sally mentioned I'm in the Midwest. I actually live in Minnesota. The University of Minnesota is our flagship school. They've gone up 570% in that same 30-year timeline. Our neighbors next door, University of Wisconsin, up 1,047%. The highest I've found so far in looking at colleges around the country is UConn. University of Connecticut has increased their prices by about 1,300% in that same 30-year timeline. I also think it's helpful for people to know kind of what pricing looks like on the college landscape today. This is actual cost of attendance, of course. This is not tuition. That would be a heart attack moment if these were just tuition numbers. But these are total cost of attendance. And I sit down and I chat college with families. My job is all educationally based. I have a team of consultants who work with our families. My job is just to help people understand what the landscape looks like. And so one of the things I do as part of my job is sit down and do free consultations with families. And that one of the things we talk about in the consultation are some schools that the student might kind of sort of be interested in. And I'm here to tell you that the kids of the country bubbling up schools that fall into the price range of these top 5 schools. The other thing I want to point out here, though, are these bottom 3 schools. The bottom 3 schools are the flagship schools of their state. And what we see is that these schools are primarily over $30,000 a year today. But I still have families showing up on my doorstep who hope to pay $20,000, $25,000 for a college education a year. And candidly, that is very challenging to do today. There are a few schools in the country who could get you to prices like that. But not many kids sit in front of me and say, Western Michigan, that's a school I'm super, super interested in, right? So I think it's helpful to just align expectations and understand that the flagship schools are hanging closer to 35,000 than 25,000 today. We'll do a little play along at home quiz. We'll see what you guys think. What percentage of students transfer at least one time? So they head off to college and find out it's not the right place for them and have to go someplace else. Is that number 6%, 14%, 25%, 38%, or 42%? Give you a second to think that over. Turns out national transfer rate today is 38%. So the reason I bring this up is because at the end of the day, many families are hoping to reduce the cost of college. They're hoping to keep prices down. Even people who can cash flow college don't prefer to overpay for their college education. And so one of the easiest ways to keep the price of college down is by actually finding a right fit school, because once you add a transfer to the mix, you have increased the cost of college. And these are state school to state school numbers. So when a student transfers just one time, it increases the cost of that degree by about $14,000. And when they transfer twice, that number jumps to $24,000. And this is interesting. Of the 38% of kids who make a poor choice the first time, almost half of those kids, 40% of those kids, make a poor choice yet again and go on to another school. So it's really important today to keep a kind of right fit, the goal. And I always tell people that means going deeper than cool campus, great sports teams to follow, and I really like the dorms, right? So we've got to go deeper than that. We are going to kick tonight off by talking about financial aid and how financial aid works. And then we're going to move on into academic fit. Those are the 2 areas we're going to cover tonight. I don't get too much into social fit here. It's a great conversation, though, for families during that family consultation. Okay, so let's talk about financial aid, because one of the things that I find to be true is that families tend to conflate what financial aid is, what it means. When I sit down and I chat college with families, they'll often say something like, well, we know we're not going to qualify for any financial aid. And what most of those families are referring to is need-based aid. But when colleges talk about financial aid, and when you go out to their websites and you see that the average student gets X amount of financial aid, that student may also be getting merit-based scholarships. And most colleges in the country also include loans in their financial aid numbers. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think about loans as aid, right? You've got to pay those back. But a lot of colleges do. So when you go out to a college website and it says something like, the average student on our campus pays X, you should just know on most campuses around the country, the average student is getting need-based aid. Because how do colleges figure out their average? They take the kids paying the most and the kids paying the least, and they average those two out. Well, the kids paying the least are getting need-based aid. So that number is often including need. It may or it may not be including merit based on who the school is as well. But it's important for people to understand if they actually don't qualify for need-based aid, the number that the college is sharing with you really is kind of irrelevant, right? It's not actually reflecting what your family will pay on that college campus. So we're going to tear these apart because they are separate buckets of money. We're going to kick it off by talking about need-based aid. And the most commonly used form to determine need has now become notorious. It is the FAFSA, of course. Some schools use a secondary profile called the CSS profile. The FAFSA and the CSS profile today kick out a number that is referred to as the Student Aid Index. So prior to 2024, this was referred to as the expected family contribution. That verbiage is now retired, and in its place is Student Aid Index. We are going to break down the FAFSA. The CSS profile is a private form. You don't get a report back. Typically what you'll see, because it's a more comprehensive form, is that many families who fill out their CSS profile find themselves much less needy by the time the profile is done. But we're going to break down the FAFSA. I think it's helpful to understand what the formula actually looks like on the FAFSA. And so we're going to break this apart. There are two sets of people that have to include their information on the FAFSA form. The first group of people are parents. When parents fill out the FAFSA, you should know that assets are being assessed at a very low 5.64%, where income is actually assessed up to 47%. So the vast majority of parents see themselves assessed at 47%. If you're over 65, that number drops down just a little bit. By comparison, students obviously also have to go on the FAFSA. It is their FAFSA after all. And what we see, our students' numbers are much, much higher. Student assets assessed at 20%, their income at 50%. Good news, most students don't have much of either of these. So they don't tend to influence the FAFSA. So the one thing I want to point out is that a 529 plan is considered a parent asset. So being assessed at that very small 5.64%. If the student happens to have some UGMA or UTMA accounts, those are assessed at this higher 20% rate. And if the student is actually the beneficiary of a trust, that actually also, their portion of it gets assessed at 20%. So that's the most common way that students' assets negatively impact a FAFSA, is that they are the beneficiary of a trust. Third parties, I have grandparents here, but it could be anybody. It could be an auntie, an uncle, a godparent, anybody who wants to help a student pay for college, not assessed at all. So on the FAFSA form, it does not ask about third-party contributors. The CSS profile does, which is why, again, often people find themselves less needy if they fill out that CSS profile. So I just want to point out first that if you are saving for college, that is good. Saving for college, always good. If you're using a 529 plan, 100% of a 529 plan is intended to pay for college, right? That's what it's for. It's a college savings plan. However, it's still only getting assessed at that tiny 5.64%. So I think it's really important to save. Make sure that you connect with a financial professional to decide like how you're going to get that done. but make sure, of course, that you save, because often when saving is not happening, the gap that saving would have covered ends up happening in a loan. And those loan interest rates are going to far surpass that little teeny tiny 5.64% over time. So I have 4 tips for you tonight. The first tip is the FAFSA really cannot be manipulated. At the end of the day, parents cannot remove themselves from the FAFSA. It is a rare 18-year-old who gets that. I'm not going to call it an opportunity even, because the circumstances that surround an independent 18-year-old are not very happy. So they have emancipated themselves from their parents. They are at risk of being homeless. Their parents are deceased. Those kids are independent. Everyone else is going to have to include their parents. The status of independent student really is aligned more for adults who are going back to school. So if you're over the age of 24, for instance, you're an adult, you don't need, for FAFSA purposes, you don't need to include your parents. If you're already an graduate, so you've graduated, got your bachelor's, you're independent. And there are several other circumstances, but they really are angled toward adults. When people fill out their FAFSA form, they should not include retirement accounts, and they should not include their primary residence. These are assets that do not get included in the formula of the FAFSA. So no 401ks, 403bs, Roth IRAs, regular IRAs, none of that goes on the FAFSA form. If you own a small business, though, or you're a farmer, you actually do need to include the assets of your business on the FAFSA form. That is new as of 2024, and there's no question it will make college much more expensive for folks in those categories. If divorce is part of the family status, only one parent is going to fill out the FAFSA, and the way you determine that today is based on who is financially supporting that student more. What the federal government did not bother to do was actually define financial support. So families have to kind of figure that piece out for themselves. What I tell people is just be able to share documentation that supports the decision that you made. Multiple kids in college at the same time no longer impact need. This is actually a relatively new development. It rolled out on 2024's FAFSA. And the kind of reality-based circumstances surrounding this mean that families who did not qualify for need-based aid with one student in college are also not going to qualify for need-based aid with 2 students in college. There are a lot of families around the country who do qualify when they have multiple kids in college. Our family benefited from this. I have 5 kids. We had 6 years where we had 2 kids in college at the same time. So we definitely benefited from that. I'm grateful. My youngest is 24 and we got him out before these FAFSA changes rolled out. There's no question this is going to negatively impact cost for families. And then one of the things that people should know, so sometimes people who suspect that they will not be need-based wonder why on earth they would need to fill out this FAFSA form in the first place then. And the short answer to that is colleges like to see these numbers. It's important to them. And so at the end of the day, one of the things that we do see are behavior changes on the part of colleges when they don't get FAFSA forms. So we always encourage our families to fill out their FAFSA. And for some schools in the country, they actually are leveraging the information they find out about the fact that the family, for instance, isn't going to need their need-based aid to actually boost the acceptance rates of students. And so it's important to just know the FAFSA is an important form to the colleges. Without it, they really don't have a sense of your ability to pay. And so we encourage people to fill that out. All right, I'm going to pause there before we jump into this next quiz and just see what questions you guys have. Feel free to just unmute yourselves if you want. You don't have to drop them in the chat. Since there are only 3 of us, I'm not worried about you being unruly.
So I do have a question, Cozy. I'm curious, business valuations, do they just accept my business valuation, or do I have to demonstrate why I think my business is worth what it is?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the assets of the business are included, which includes the net worth. Um, and the short answer is yes, they're just accepting yours. This kind of falls under that same category as I mentioned for the divorce families. You do need to be able to document and share documentation around that valuation should you get audited. So I always tell people do the best job you can here. The way the new FAFSA works is it actually is a adapting form. So as you answer questions, so if you answer the question, do you have a business with the answer yes, then additional questions pop up and a table pops up that says, if the value of your business is X, please input this amount of money. So the form helps you along that pathway. But from a, how do I go about valuing my business? What I always tell people is, add up the assets minus their, any debt you might have on them, right? So farmers, for instance. If you own the building that your business is in, then you need to include
Yeah.
that. Unsold merchandise, you need to include that. If you're a service, though, the value of your business is just what its market value might be if you decided to sell it.
And one last question, and then I'm curious if my business is real estate. I'm in the business of real estate. Do they look at the asset value or the income value?
Yeah, so the income piece will be taken care of by your adjusted gross from your tax return.
Okay,
So
that's
they're
true.
actually looking at the net worth
Okay,
for the asset side of the house.
okay.
Any other questions? Those were good ones.
Cozy, I'm curious across that set of schools that you shared the percentage of the price increases over time. What are you also seeing around financial aid budgets and scholarship relative to that? How are those growing? And then I'm also curious if there still exists any advantage in a student prepaying if a family member or a grandparent is in a position to do that. Is there still any advantage out there in terms of rate year over year to do a prepay?
Yeah, great questions. So big picture, and this aligns with one of those trends that we're seeing impacting cost and acceptance, is the volume of schools that are creeping into the more selective space. As schools gain popularity and notoriety, right? The University of Tennessee today is a good example. It's the new Clemson. So as schools creep into that space, and the biggest place we've seen this are in the tier twos, like Boston College, BU, Northeastern. Those schools used to have scholarship dollars available. They no longer really do, because with the volume of applications they're getting today, it's cut their acceptance rates in half. And if I go from 25% acceptance rate to say 13%, I don't really have to give away money anymore. So while prices continue to increase, depending on the school, we actually are seeing scholarship dollars decrease over time. Now, it's not true in all schools. I was at a high school last night and I was talking to the high school counselor who is actually, she does a lot of work outside in the college space, and she works with a nonprofit who helps low income kids get off, who are super Sharpie, get off to go to schools that would be great for them. And we were talking last night about how the middle is starting to drop out of the college space, right? So we've got the private highly selectives and the public highly selectives sitting over here in the, I'm going to use the big term Ivy, even though they're not Ivy League schools, right? And then we've got our public schools sitting over here. And the schools that hang out in the middle, which tend to be the better gifting, merit gifting, private colleges, are starting to whittle down. They're dropping out of the market. They're closing their doors. Schools are buying them up and making them a satellite. And so consequently, if that continues, right, if this middle continues to drop out, we're going to end up with schools that really, truly can charge whatever they want. and then our public institutions. And there will likely be an imbalance then about how we look at those degrees. So I'm really super hopeful that's not going to happen. But for the time being anyway, prices continue to increase about 8 to 13% over the last couple of years we've seen. And the scholarship dollars not keeping up with that. And did I miss the second part of your?
What was the second
Yeah,
question?
the prepay, is there
prepay.
any advantage to prepay anymore?
For sure, if you can find an institution that'll allow it, I would prepay, right? Because you are in essence shortcutting then those increases. A lot of schools have dropped the opportunity to do that for that exact reason. But if you can find schools who will do it, for sure, there's a benefit to that.
Are there some still doing it? I guess that was more my question. Or is that number so tiny now?
Yeah, it's pretty small. There's some,
Okay.
there's schools in Florida that allow it because Florida has a full on, it's kind of their 529 plan is a prepay program. So there are a few states in the country that still allow for that, but most schools have dropped those prepaid programs for that exact reason.
Okay.
George, you unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question with regards to payment, or do they alter their conclusions year to year, or does it make a difference? In other words, in our case, we're grandparents, and we want to be able to help our grandchildren. But the question is, should you help them, or should you wait till after they get through school? You know what I mean? Because if you start
Yes.
giving them some money ahead of time, then the colleges pick that up and all of a sudden change their recommendations if they're on it because, well, for example, I mean, if you get a divorced mother with a couple of kids and she doesn't have the assets, she doesn't have all the things, so she's, they're very, very smart, so they're liable to get scholarships. They're like, you know what I mean? It's opportune for them. But the question is, if we get involved, does that change everything? Or is it better just to say, look, we'll worry about it when you get out of school?
Yeah, this is a great question. The beautiful thing about the FAFSA change is that grandparents who want to help a grand student pay for college can do so, and it really does not negatively impact the student. So if the student's getting need-based aid through the college itself, grandparents' information is not going to creep onto that FAFSA. They don't have to tell the school about the help that you're providing. Now, if say you're just writing checks to the college, there are colleges who will line up that information and go, okay, this is not their parent, right? It's clearly not the student. Somebody else is helping them pay and might amend need-based aid. Merit-based aid, on the other hand, does typically apply for all 4 years. So you don't usually see amendments of that year over year over year. So what I tell grandparents is like, look, either if you're saving in a 529 plan, just have the money come out of the 529 plan. There isn't so much alignment there. And then you can also, of course, there are gifting tax issues to just gifting direct to the student, but that would be another way you could do it while they're in college.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And the gifting to the student no longer, did it used to qualify as income to them?
Yes.
And is that still the case?
No, that's the piece that got rewritten, right?
Okay.
So it used to be that grandparent contributions would basically creep into the FAFSA because the student had to claim it as untaxed income. And then it got assessed at 50% as untaxed income. But when they rewrote all the legislation that didn't really benefit most of us, that was one area that super benefits students if they have a third party who's interested in helping the student pay. All right, I have another quiz for you. Of the pathways I'm going to give you here, think about which of these that you feel might be the least expensive path. Is it choosing a 4-year public college? Is it starting at a 2-year school and then transferring to a 4-year school? Is it starting at a public college and transferring to a private college? Or is it starting at and finishing at a 4-year private university? So I'll give you a second to think about this. It turns out, this is a trick question. It could be all the above. It depends on who the student is, what state they live in, and the circumstances that surround the student, meaning their academic background, their financial background, all of those things. Today, there is no singular right answer to that question. I can't, if you said to me, Cozy, what's the least expensive path to college? I couldn't give you a single answer. I would need to know more about the student and their background. And so today it's really important to understand that there are so many nuances here that impact cost and acceptance that you can't just autopilot say to students, go to the two-year school and transfer. That might be less expensive, but it also might not be less expensive. It depends on the school they end up transferring to. It also depends on whether or not there is a connection between the two-year school and the four-year school. It might be better for them to start at and finish at a private university. So today there just really isn't, it's not so clear any longer that there's just one path that makes it the least expensive path. And so today what we see is that you really do have to change the way you think. So when I started our college searches, I told my kids, I don't care where you go, just stay in the state of Minnesota, go to a state school, right? Because I just assumed that would be the least expensive path. Turns out I could not have been more wrong. When we look at our bottom 3 kids, one of my kids went to the public flagship school. She went to University of Minnesota. One of my kids went to a private school. She went to Drake University in Des Moines. And then one of my kids went to an out-of-state state school, University of Missouri, Kansas City campus. Of those 3, the public flagship, the private, and the out-of-state state school, the least expensive was the private school, followed by the out-of-state state school, followed, the most expensive was our local flagship school. The private school was $10,000 less a year than our public institution, and the out-of-state state school was $8,000 less a year than our public institution. So today, the way you have to think about colleges is, are those schools flexibly priced or are they inflexibly priced? Because there are public and private schools in both of those 2 categories. If you remain thinking about colleges as in-state, out-of-state, public, and private, you're basically playing on the 1994 version of Let's Go to College. The colleges, though, are over here playing the 2024 version, right? So it's important to align yourself with the new rules and the new landscape so that you really are thinking about this in a healthy way, in a way that actually serves the student and the family the best. So today, when we think about scholarships that actually reduce the price of college, those scholarships do typically come from the colleges. So back in my day, what you did was hop around town, right? And you stopped at the bank and applied for their scholarship, and you stopped at a couple of local businesses and applied for their scholarships, and you managed to rack up $250 and you paid for a fourth of the cost of your semester. Well, today, if you jump to the bank and the Rotary Club and the Lions Club and the local business and you manage to gather up $1,000, congrats, you bought books, right? It doesn't really move the price of college. And so today, the colleges are the way that you do this. And the way to think about this, there are basically 3 ways to impact what scholarships get to come your way. And the number 1 way you do that, and this bubble should be way bigger. I always say I'm going to make it bigger, and then I always forget. The college list is the single best way to bring scholarships your way. Because at the end of the day, the schools that make it to the list are the way you determine this. I mentioned earlier, you're not going to find scholarships at Duke. You're not going to find scholarships at Boston College. You're not going to find scholarships at University of Chicago. Right? None of those schools bring scholarship dollars to the table just because they really don't have to. Duke had 54,000 applicants for 1,700 spots. There's no reason for that school to give away money. They just don't have to do that. And so if scholarships, because there are families that don't care about reducing the price of college, right? They've saved well, or they're high net worth families, and that's fine. But if that's a priority, you have to make sure you get the right schools on the list in the first place, because you can't squeeze scholarships out of schools that don't do it. After that, The other two ways you impact scholarships are the decisions the student makes while they're in high school and how they represent those decisions on their essay and application process. When you pull those three things together, the college list, the decisions they make, and how they represent themselves, that's when you start to create scholarship packages. And so as a family, what kinds of things should you be thinking about? What should you be looking for if you want scholarships to be part of the discussion? Well, the first thing you need to know is, does the school offer this in the first place? And for a lot of schools, the acceptance rate is the driver here, right? If the schools have acceptance rates under 30%, there's not a lot of incentive for them to give away money. People will always say, well, my kid's so awesome. Of course they would want to give them money. And I always say, yep, your kid is awesome, but so are a million other kids. So, and that doesn't make your kid less special. It just makes a lot of kids going off to college, basically, right? And lots of them are smart. So you've got to know whether the school actually even does scholarship dollars to start with. Merit aid is about all things amazing and wonderful about the kids that help the school with the things the college cares about. Because at the end of the day, colleges are businesses. They are making business decisions. So once you know the school brings scholarship dollars to the table, what are some of the things that they're thinking about? Well, the first thing they are looking for are students that can help them with their average incoming GPA and their average incoming test score. So the value here is the student is helping draw up the average incoming score at a school. When we look at our flagship schools, if we look back about 4 years, the vast majority of them had average incoming GPAs around a 3.5, 3.6. Today, when we look at those flagship schools, they have bounced up to just under 3.7, and many are over 3.7. We're going to look at this later, but UVA is sitting at a 4.32 as their average incoming GPA, right? So they're looking for kids that help them draw that up. Extracurricular talents matter, but not typically in the way that parents and kids think. The colleges are not looking for well-rounded kids. They are looking to be a well-rounded campus, which means that students should just focus on who they are. So if you're the sport kid, great, no reason for you to join art club, right? If you're the art kid, you love the theater, no reason to go join a sport, right? What kids need to think about is, what do I care about? And then just make sure that's well represented in their activities list. And then be demographically interesting. This is the easiest thing to do. And most parents, like me, cut ourselves off, right? Stay in the state, go to state school. Because I just assumed if we left our state, it was going to be more expensive. Turns out often it's not, right? The one thing University of New Hampshire doesn't need is another New Hampshire applicant. They've got plenty of New Hampshire applicants. They've got plenty of Massachusetts applicants, right? Schools get the vast majority of their applicants from the local region. And so you are really interesting if you're willing to leave your region and go a little bit further away. But you know what? So I meet with a lot of students. I probably meet with 1,000 families a year. The kids talk a good game. They always talk about like wanting to go far, but when push comes to shove and they go to make that final decision, guess what they do? They often stay close. And so this is a really easy way to bump up your scholarship package. So I want to share the recipe for scholarships. At the end of the day, it's helpful to understand how the colleges think. This is one school's recipe card, but it is very common categories around how schools think about pricing their product. So demonstrated interest is an area of scholarship where the college understands kind of who the kids are who are most interested in them. So they're looking for kids, and they're going to boost the scholarship package for the kids who are going to interact with them on a regular basis because they know they've got a better shot at reeling that kid in and putting him in a chair. And so if they can sweeten the pot just a little bit, that's what they're going to do. This school giving quite a bit of money for that unusual student. There's this very nerdy statistic called the export rate of students. And the state of Texas hardly ever exports any of their kids. Most kids in Texas stay in Texas and go to school. Minnesota, right up there where I live as well, 74% of our kids stay in the state or touch one of our regions. So we are also one of those rarer kids, right? So this is super valuable. The next few categories are all about finding successful students. At the end of the day, every college wants to find kids, bring them onto their campus who are going to be successful on their campus. They want them to come, elbow through a couple majors, because everybody does, and get out of here in 4 years. And so they know if they can choose students that are just stronger, students who made stronger decisions around their classes, for instance, in high school, that those kids will be more successful. Just for filling out financial aid forms, it is not unusual for colleges to sweeten the scholarship package just a little bit. That's how important those numbers are to the colleges. And then the essay at a lot of schools can be worth quite a bit of money. At schools that don't do merit scholarship dollars, the essay can be a really key factor to acceptance. And so it is worthy of spending time and attention on this. When we work with families, we actually do spend quite a bit of time on their essay. All right, so I want to talk about early decision because schools are leaning in to early decision. And so when a student applies via early decision, it's a kind of application, right? It's an application date. It's important for the student and the family to understand it is a decision. You are telling the school, I am coming. If you let me in, I will come. And I promise that I will withdraw all my other applications, right? So you are putting all of your eggs into a single basket. For that reason, you should use it strategically. So not all schools take the same volume of students out of early decision application pools. Wake Forest last year took 58% of their freshman class out of early decision. Other schools don't take anywhere near that number. Last I looked, Cornell only took 10 to 12%. So it's not the same at every single school. And so if you're going to use this very distinct application style, you want to make sure that you use it someplace where it's actually elevating your likelihood of success. The rules around early decision, though, no longer restrict the overall number of applications the student can put out. They can only use early decision once, but you can apply early action or early application at other schools. That's not a problem. But if that school you use early decision with lets you in, then you have to withdraw those applications. It's really important that people not use early decision if they can't afford the school in the first place. If you can't afford sticker price at this school, you should not use early decision. And people always say to me, yeah, but you can back out now, right? You can back out if you can't afford the school. It's true, you can back out. There is no worse conversation to have with your student in the spring of senior year, however, than I know you love this school. I know you went through the time and the trouble to get your stuff out the door for early decision. We can't afford the school, you can't go. That is a terrible conversation to have in spring of senior year because they also put all their mental eggs into that basket. So it's really important. If you don't think you can afford the school, then you don't use early decision. And as mentioned, as schools get more and more selective, one of the things that we're seeing is that they are leaning into early decision. There were several schools last year that took as much as 70 and 80% of their freshman classes out of early decision. Because for the college, of course, it guarantees their freshman class, right? It doesn't necessarily help families. It could help your student, though. The one thing I do tell people is, look, if you can cash flow college, and your student loves this school so much that they will go there and they want to go there, you can use early decision to significantly boost your opportunity to get into that school. I always want to give people kind of a lay of the landscape, if you will. around acceptance rates, because the volume of schools falling into the highly selective, and we would count that as schools with acceptance rates under 30%, continues to grow. And it's not just the private selective schools. You can see the bottom three here are all public institutions. University of Texas at 6.4%, University of Michigan at 17%, UVA at 19%. These are challenging schools to get into, and I still meet a lot of families that just assume they can plop themselves over in the local flagship school, and it is not always easy to get into those colleges. Likewise, as mentioned earlier, the average incoming GPA for colleges continue to climb, making it more and more challenging for students to get in, again, at their local flagship school. You can see the number of public institutions just sitting on this list and what the average incoming GPAs are there. And I included University of Tennessee. I mentioned this earlier. This is the new growth area. So, and so funny, I met with a kid this afternoon. He's thinking about transferring, and guess who was on his list? University of Tennessee. It is the new Clemson. It is much, much harder to get into Clemson today, and so people are transitioning. I always joke that it's all the northern kids who are trying to find a southern school that has value that they can get into because they're all tired of winter. But it's important to really understand that you don't just smart your way into a bunch of the schools in the country any longer. So acceptance rate is more than just grades and test scores, right? As mentioned, the big brand schools, the selective schools, if they have big name recognition, I always tell people, if you know who they are and they're not in your region, they're a big brand school. And so you have to be more than smart today. That includes things like passion projects or a service project, taking something that you love and you're kind of passionate about and just going deep on steroids is the way to think about this. You've got to be able to set yourself apart from other kids who apply to those schools. UCLA last year had 147,000 applicants, 147,000 applicants for about 9,000 spots. So you have to find a way to set yourself apart. Even if your student is not looking at selective schools, they also still want to make sure that the activities list that they have reflects who they are. At the end of the day, there's no magic number of activities, and there isn't a magic combination of activities. Kids will often say to me, what should I be doing to increase my likelihood of getting into X school, whatever X school is? And this might be the 3-4 kid trying to get into the average incoming GPA of a 3.6 school, right? So how does that student boost their likelihood of acceptance? Thinking about the activities you're involved in and just doing something a little bit extra, not more, but deeper than the average student is willing to do. All right, this is our last quiz. In 2002, there were 134 perfect ACTs. That's a 36 on the ACT. How many were there in 2022? So just 20 years later, is that number 306, 585, 1257, or 2542?
2542.
You're correct. That is correct.
Ah!
So, and I want to point out in 2022, there were fewer kids applying to schools overall than there were in 2002. And yet the volume of kids with perfect scores, and this number, that 2542 is perfect scores. That does not include the 35s and the 34s and the 33s, right? So there are a lot of very smart kids around. And so you've got to do more than smart if you're interested in kind of the bigger brand schools. So that brings us to our last tip. Testing still matters. Plan appropriately. The ACT and the SAT now are seen basically as equal. The schools will accept either score. So there's no reason a student needs to do both of these tests. Schools are stepping back into the test required space. There was a really interesting study released last spring that demonstrated pretty compellingly to the colleges that test score, not GPA, is a better reflection of student success. And so consequently, what we saw were schools stepping right back into that test required space. After that announcement, both Duke and Brown went straight back to test required for the classes of 2026. University of Texas, who has been test blind, don't send us a test, we're not going to look at it, test blind for 15 years, is going back to test required. They made the announcement about a week after this test study was released for the class of 2027. So schools are going to start stepping back into this space. And this is partially due to the amount of artificial inflation that is happening in the GPA pools at high schools. So high schools used to only weight AP and IB classes. These are college level work classes. There are a lot of high schools today, though, that don't have teachers certified in those style of classes. And so they start to weight their honors, their accelerated. And of course, that's not college level work. And so what colleges are discovering is kids are showing up on their campuses as freshmen, and they're actually not ready to be there, right? Their GPA doesn't actually reflect the readiness level for being a college freshman. And so that's part of the reason we see them stepping back into this space. Get prep that fits the student. You're going to be competing against kids who have, there is a lot of different prep opportunities available. They aren't all expensive. So getting prep that aligns with how the student learns is an important way to think about that. And then lastly, make decisions about sending the test after the student is done taking them. When they register for these, both the ACT and the SAT prompt the student to put the school codes in for the schools they want to share the test with. Well, when you're starting your test prep journey, you don't really know for a fact who you want to send this test score to. You might know who your schools are, but you may not want to send the score that you get to every single school. So, if the student oversleeps, doesn't eat breakfast, forgets their number 2 pencils, and also forgets their calculator, that was my kid, by the way, that very first test score, that was not something we were interested in sharing with anybody because it was not his best work for sure. And you might get to the end of all the testing and decide, I'm going to send my test score to these 4 schools, but not these 2, right? So I don't recommend that people put the scores in before they even take the test. So lastly, I want to leave you with some thoughts. I really hope people search for success, not brand. At the end of the day, college is not a prize, right? It's a match. You should be looking for a school that's going to be your partner in your success. It is not a prize to run around and let everybody know what school you got into. Instead, you should be cheering on the schools that are super excited to partner with you around the student's success. Not all schools have the same academic environments. Not every kid is a butt-in chair, listen to lots of lecturing and take lots of notes kid, right? Some students are better hands-on learners. Some do a better job in the cooperative programs where they're working in their field while they get their degree. There are lots of different ways to approach this, and it's important that you do think about things like teaching format. 80% of kids change their major, so we should just plan for that. We do it when we work with families. We make sure that not only is there plan A, but there's also plan B and C. I wish I had a penny every time a kid told me they were going to be an engineer, because I would be a wealthy woman today, because most of those kids do not go on and become engineers. So it's important to just plan for that. If they've got a great, engineering brain, what other majors at this school could also be interesting to them for that mathy, analytical style brain? And then talking through what kind of support a student needs on campus, I think is really important. College is often the first time that 4.0 kid stumbles, scrapes their knee, and has to pick themselves back up again, right, academically. And so it's a good opportunity while you're doing your college search to talk about all the support services on a college campus, the tutoring centers, the writing centers. If your student has a 504 plan or an IEP in high school, how does that transition to supported help on a college campus? All of that should be chatted about before they head off to school.
You hear that?
Mhm.
So a little bit about us, and then happy to field whatever remaining questions you have. The industry is changing all the time. It's literally changing under our feet. Most families are going to do a college search, maybe one, maybe two. I did it 5 times. Most people don't outpace me. But the goal here is just to know what's happening in the industry at the time that the student is actually looking for school, and is really hard for parents to keep on top of this. So that's what we do. We do help families navigate the entirety of the college search, application, and acceptance process. So that 38% transfer rate drops to less than 4% when we get the opportunity to work with a student. We can ensure that the schools meet the family budget for college. And this is my favorite thing that we do. We get to be a neutral third party. Of my 5 kids, 4 are girls. They have all mastered the eyeball roll, and I never get to be the smartest person in the room at the time. So being that neutral third party can be really helpful. Students know we've got their back, but parents also know we've got their back. So it's a great opportunity to just kind of bring people together, bring down that stress level. So as mentioned, I do free consultations. I do these all the time. The goal here is just to get families' questions answered about college. So we talk about the 3 areas: academic fit, social fit, and financial fit. And I'll suggest goals. So the student should be part of this conversation, plus the parents, and we're going to walk through those goal areas together. I can help do a rough FAFSA outcome, so help you understand what the student aid index would be, so the family will know, are you going to be need-based at some colleges or not? So if you have a sophomore or junior child or grandchild, do take advantage of that free consultation. It's really easy to do. I have a Google form. I'm going to share a QR code here in a second that you can use to request that. If your students are too young, go ahead and fill out the form. The best time for us to connect is typically second half of sophomore year. But if the student is high stress and they're a student that is typically sweating out every B, then meeting sooner than later is often helpful. Do follow our Facebook page. We put a ton of free content just sitting out there, and it's yours to do with as you choose. We also do a family newsletter. It comes once a month. We don't spam people. We don't believe in that. And then do share us with people you know. If you have high schoolers or high school grandchildren, you probably have friends who also have high schoolers or high school grandchildren. So feel free to share that family consultation with them as well. And so if you want to use the QR code with your phone, you can use that to get a copy of this presentation. I'm happy to send it to you. We are recording it, so Sally can certainly share the recording as well. You can request the consultation. And if you have a group of people that traditionally get together and you're thinking, man, this would have been so good for my church youth group and the parents involved in that, please let me know, because I do these. This is my job. I got into this because I wanted more people to understand how the college process works. It is very challenging for people to get this. And so if you know groups of people that we should talk to, I would be happy to do that. All right. Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you able to give advice on out of the country schools, say in Canada?
Yes, we do international searches. I always say international plus Canada. I know it's technically international, but for many parts of the US, it's our neighbors next door, right? So,
Right.
yes, absolutely, we can do that. I'm going to stop sharing so you guys are big again. Other questions? Awesome. Well, if we got everybody's questions answered, a huge thank you to Sally for having me, and thanks you guys for carving out time tonight.
Yeah, and thank you, Cozy. It's true. We did record this, and we will put it on a YouTube channel. I'll put that out to all of you if you're interested, so that if you do have, friends that I had a couple of people who said,